So when I was asked to speak, quite frankly, my initial reaction is, what is it that I could possibly have to say and why me? The why me was really simple because Shay knew I couldn't say no. But in terms of why she asked me in the first place, I'm not really sure. I can tell you that through my work, we've developed a number of diversionary programs in the city of Philadelphia. The fact is, we see a problem, we try and find a fix. The drug treatment court developed long before I became in charge, but along the way, we've done any number of things to address problems, including a diversion program for domestic violence and a diversion program to address those who are out purchasing sex, to make them aware with our partnership through JJPI, which you may hear about subsequently, called Sexual Education and Responsibility class, where we try and make people more aware, not only of the potential consequences to themselves being out and buying sex on the street, but more importantly, the damage and the harm and the circumstances of the people who are out on street corners selling sex. Which segues over to the program. I think of all the diversion programs that I preside over, I think the one I'm the most passionate about is the Project Dawn Court. Although as much as I'm the most passionate about, I have to say it's probably the most gut-wrenching and probably has fewer participants because of the requirements and the screening processes, but the days presiding over Project Dawn Court with fewer participants is probably, they are the most agonizing days that I spend. Forget about trying to herd, 26 other judges and administrators and scheduling cases and making everybody happy. And when you're dealing with other judges, they are co-equal to me. I may be the supervisor, but they are all independently elected. And if I suggest something they don't like, they certainly have no problem telling me that I don't have any authority over them, and I can only hope that I can corral them into doing things that I ask. But the Project Dawn women, as opposed to most diversion programs where we focus on people who are newly into the criminal justice system to try and catch them in the beginning, to redirect them, to provide services and restorative justice. Unfortunately, the way we set up the program is to address people who have been in the system multiple times. It was done for any number of reasons, but the people who come to us and agree to accept the program are people who have been involved in street-level prostitution, they've been involved in drug activity, and if those were the only issues, we would be in pretty good shape. Unfortunately, they have all come to us from broken situations. They are involved in being exploited. Most of them have been abused over a period of time. They can trace their tortured histories and their trauma back to really early ages. And what we learned through Project Dawn that we've tried to take and expand to other programs is that we're never going to make them whole if we are unable to address the trauma that they have suffered. And other people, I'm sure, later in the afternoon will talk more thoroughly and in detail about the need for trauma treatment. I can just tell you from our firsthand experience how fortunate we were by developing a partnership with the JJPI, which stands for Joseph J. Peters Institute in Philadelphia. They have any number of incredible counselors who have worked with us, and we have watched the evolution of battered, broken people who have been controlled by so many people throughout their lives transition into being incredible human beings who, frankly, they don't even recognize themselves. They, forget about the physical transformation that you see from an individual who comes in addicted to heroin to somebody who was living on a street corner, who is now, proud of the fact that they are drug-free. They are proud of the fact that they now have independent living. They are concerned about how they present, and if you were to put two photographs side by side from beginning to end, in many of these cases you wouldn't even recognize the individuals. But we, along the way, have them working to get jobs as they start transitioning out of a full-time drug treatment regimen, and one of the things that they encounter on a regular basis, as other people do, is that there are so many places in our society that are not criminal record friendly, and that they come in excited, they have jobs, and they come back 2 weeks later. I think I'm going to have a wonderful conversation with them, asking about how their job is, and instead I hear that the criminal background record came back, and most of them are without jobs. Now I have to say, there is a lot going on with criminal justice reform. There are any number of companies who were previously unwilling to take people with criminal records who are now have a little more of an open mind, and with each success story, they're willing to try someone else. But with regard to the women who have been exploited, there's a new opportunity that exists for them to have the record of these arrests through the vacator process eliminated completely. And it is a huge success from the Institute to have been able to push this through the legislature. And now its success is going to depend on people like you and you spreading the word to other individuals that this opportunity is out there. One of the things I would caution, I have received some of these petitions, and I've had conversations with some of the people in the room, and some of the initial petitions are so clear and obvious that they should be granted, that people were exploited, that they were brought into the world of sexual exploitation, and that alone was the catalyst that caused all their arrests and all their convictions, and that they now, with your assistance, have an opportunity for a clean slate. There are others that are not quite as clear, and I think that's where it's going to take really good lawyering that I'm sure exists in this room and with the assistance of the Institute, because there needs to be a connection from point one. And when you have a 6-year hiatus where life seems to be going fine, and then somebody finds themselves re-involved in the criminal justice system, you have to be able to present, and I use the word spin without suggesting it in the negative connotation that we sometimes talk about spinning something negatively or in a way that's dishonest, because I don't mean to suggest that at all. But it takes more probing, and it takes more probably more patience when you deal with the individuals, because retelling their stories is traumatizing. And what you want to make sure along the way is they're not being re-victimized in order to get the benefit of no conviction by having to go through the process of sharing the horrific details that they have endured. But I'm sure with counseling, along the way from those who have greater expertise than I, that it's a process that can be safely put in your hands so that the benefits of actually recovering from the horrific past is something that can be done as part of a clean slate. And I'm really pleased that our legislature has recognized the trauma that these women have undergone, the force that has been exerted on them, and that put them in the position that they were in, resulting in these convictions. And there's new hope for them and an opportunity. So I hope you all pursue those opportunities. You do it with kindness and with grace so that they have the end benefit without having any additional trauma exerted upon them in the process of getting to an end result.
Judge Neifield, thank you. Thank you for indulging me for all the years that you've indulged me, which is way more than I would admit. And I'm fortunate to have you not only as a mentor, as a strong woman attorney and judge in my life, but involved in this institute with Michelle and I on a daily basis. So seriously, thank you for believing in what we do. I am so lucky to have two of my advisory board members here today, one of whom is Jamie Manarakiza, who you're going to hear from in the second hour. But I have to tell you that I have learned more about how to be a good lawyer and how to represent clients who have been traumatized from collaborating with Jamie than I have from any CLEs that I could have attended, talking with detectives and trying cases for years, talking to my colleagues and former colleagues at the DA's offices and in the Defender Association. I've learned more from Jamie on how to be a good lawyer and how to be a trauma-informed lawyer. So I'm just thrilled. I'm like introducing you like you're gonna get up in 2 seconds. But I just want you guys to know that when you walk out of here today, if there is 1 hour that you actually pay attention, it's to Jamie, because she's tremendous. And how she explains trauma, specifically anybody who's experienced trauma from interpersonal violence, is just amazing. So I do want to give you a shout out. I also want to give a shout out to Julie Eubler and Steve Wall and their charitable family fund for making this CLE possible today and for making the Justice for Victims Fellowship possible. We have a new attorney on board with us. Hopefully, attorney, you're getting your bar results soon. But Michelle, can you believe that we have 2 lawyers working for us now? I mean, in 4 years, it's been pretty crazy. So, to the direct services work, we could not do it without the financial support of the Eubler-Wall Charitable Family Fund, and I wanted to say thank you to them. So let's get to the nuts and bolts of this CLE, because that's why you're here. It's really critical for all of you who want to engage in vacatur work and representing survivors of commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking to understand the human trafficking law, both the federal trafficking law and the state trafficking law, and be able to apply it, because it's critical in filing these petitions that you have a clear understanding of what that is. We really hope that you walk out of here today understanding the multifaceted victim services needs that these survivors have, and also understand that as lawyers, you can't do this work without engaging in cross-disciplinary collaboration with social service providers and those who provide victim support. I always tell my students and any of the students here in the law school, as well as attorneys, that we're in the business of solving people's legal problems. And Judge Neifield alluded to this, but when you're working with survivors and you are trying to help them solve their legal problem, the information that you're going to get from them, that you need to get from them to solve that legal problem, is going to hurt them. It's going to re-traumatize them, because it's asking them to relive their most horrific life experiences, because we have to put those in the petitions, and Sarah's going to talk to you about how to do that. So it's critical that you engage with a cross-disciplinary team. Jamie's going to talk to you about how psychological trauma impacts survivors throughout their recovery, and you'll learn that it's a process. And I'm hopeful that all of you will realize why post-conviction relief is really critical in this space for survivors of sex trafficking, and that you walk out of here feeling confident that you have the skills you need to engage and practice trauma-informed lawyering. Sarah, is this working? Here we go, clicker works. So, has anybody in here, and my former students and current students don't count, had a training on trafficking? Anyone? So some of you have. Human trafficking is not human smuggling. Do you guys know the difference? So we hear a lot about human trafficking. People think that it's foreign nationals coming across the US border into our country because we're a great country, and that is in fact trafficking. That's not true. That's a different and distinct crime. That's the crime of smuggling. So if you are brought into the US over the borders and you're paying someone to help you get into the US, that is a separate and distinct crime. It doesn't mean that once you are here in the US that you couldn't be trafficked for forced labor or commercial sex. It's not the same thing. Trafficking connotes that term movement. Transportation is not essential to the crime of trafficking. Who are the perpetrators? It's not just pimp-controlled prostitution, which it is, but it could be a family member, an intimate partner, an acquaintance, or a stranger. Victims do not fit into a cookie cutter mold. They are not one size fits all, and they come from all walks of life. There's oftentimes overlap with co-occurring crimes, including domestic violence, and it is not exclusive to urban areas. We know that it's happening here in our Commonwealth, in rural communities, suburban communities, and in our cities. So it's really critical that you guys understand just sort of the nuts and bolts on how to apply the trafficking law. So I'm going to start with the federal trafficking law. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed into law by Congress in the year 2000. It's been reauthorized at least, I think, 5 times at this point, and it is up for reauthorization again. So we've had a federal law of both labor trafficking and sex trafficking for 18 years. Just keep in mind that we've only had a comprehensive Pennsylvania trafficking law for 4. So that's a big difference, right? So the TVPA defines labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and the key definitions are involuntary servitude, and in the space of sex trafficking, understanding what a commercial sex act is. And just to tell you what the definition is under federal law, it's a condition of servitude induced by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that if the person did not enter into or continue in such condition, that person or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint or the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. It's a long definition. And what is a commercial sex act? It's any sex on account of which anything of value is given to or received by anyone. It doesn't have to be money. It could be food. It could be clothing. It could be shelter. Anything of value. So I could read you what the definition, you're all lawyers, you know how to go to the US Crimes Code and look up section 1591. But I think it's important for you to recognize that right in the title of section 1591, it's sex trafficking of children or by force, fraud, and coercion. The title could be a little bit longer and more explanatory if it said sex trafficking of children or adults by force, fraud, and coercion. So what we know right here from the title is that force, fraud, and coercion is not an element of the crime, does not have to be investigated, does not have to be proven by the government if the victim is a minor. On the other hand, if the victim is an adult, we have to get into what constitutes force, fraud, and coercion. I'm going to make this easy for you guys. You need 3 things to prove the crime of human trafficking. And this is both true for Pennsylvania law and the federal law. You need 3 things. You need to have an act, by a means, for a purpose. What's our purpose? Since we're talking about sex trafficking, I've already told you guys that purpose has to be a commercial sex act. Anything of value in exchange for a sex act. So you need an act by a means for that commercial sex act. What are our acts? You only need one. You don't need all of them. Most times you will find that there is more than one, but you only need one of the following: recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, advertising, maintains, patronizes, or solicits, or knowingly financially benefiting or receiving anything of value, basically from helping out with those acts. Okay, so just a quick example of what that would mean is the act of harbor. Where does harboring most oftentimes happen in cases involving sex trafficking? Hotels. So the hotel isn't necessarily engaging in the act of harboring, the trafficker is, but the hotel could be knowingly benefiting financially, or the hotel employees could be knowingly benefiting financially for being in on it. Does that make sense? Okay. The means are force, fraud, and coercion. It's coercion that's hard, and that's why Jamie is here to talk to you guys about trauma and what that coercion really means. But what is force, fraud, and coercion? It's threats, physical abuse, kidnapping, extortion, use of drugs, duress, controlling property, withholding food. Again, you don't need the means if the victim is a child. Well, who is a child? Anybody under the age of 18. So what you guys also really need to keep in mind is that there is a broad spectrum of conduct that's criminalized in the law. It doesn't just apply to traffickers. Who are traffickers, right? I've already told you, it could be pimp-controlled prostitution. It could be a family member. It could be a manager, the brothel owner, the person who's the madam or the mama-san at the illicit massage parlor. They're the traffickers. But the federal and state law also criminalizes the conduct of sex buyers and those third-party facilitators. And I've already told you guys that we know that the hotels could be those third-party facilitators, those that are knowingly benefiting financially from helping with the criminal enterprise. So what are these acts? Let's break them down a little bit. What's recruiting? It's targeting vulnerable children and adults. It doesn't need to be in the pursuit of money. It could be for housing. It could be for drugs, companionship, safety. And oftentimes we see traffickers using bottom girls to recruit. We're engaging in some research right now in the Institute. Is a bottom girl a victim or is a bottom girl an offender? And for those of you who don't know what a bottom is, it's a woman who has probably been with the pimp the longest. She might not even be an adult yet. She could be a teenager who more often than not has a child with the trafficker, is considered his favorite, and as her reward for enduring the pain and suffering for a long time, gets to help. And I use that term gets to loosely because there are genuinely consequences for not engaging in recruiting. So traffickers use their bottom to engage in recruiting and enforcing the rules. What does entices mean? Buying gifts, clothing, beauty products, treatments, false promises, selling the dream. It's also the creation of pseudo-family dynamics. There's a dictionary out there on a website called genderberg.org. You can just Google the prostitution dictionary, and there's a whole language that I had to learn when I was the prosecutor in the Project Dawn Court, so that I could understand what these women are talking about, so that I could meet them at their level, and I would just ask them, what does that mean? But they do create a whole family dynamic. They're told they must call their pimp if it's a male daddy or uncle. They refer to each other as wife or wife-in-law or wifey. Again, it's that creation of that pseudo-family dynamic so they feel as though they belong and they can't be anywhere else. Provides. It's finding the sex buyers. It's arranging the dates. It could also be giving them McDonald's once a week. Harbors, right? We've got this hotel industry litigation that's pending nationally. We have 2 cases in Pennsylvania. Both have been brought on this side of the state against the hotel industries that, honestly, I always knew from the very beginning that the Roosevelt Inn up on Route 1 was going to be the first one sued, right? We knew that was the no-tell motel or the Pimps R Us motel, and there's been so much trafficking going in and out on that, and it's made the national news. There's a YouTube video out there from CNN. There was a shootout that happened in the hallways of the Roosevelt Inn, and those individuals were convicted by the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, and we know that the motive behind that was pimps fighting over the women and children, because there were teenage girls involved, that they were selling for sex. And what's really fascinating to me about this video is that it's kind of like rap video style. They're shooting at each other, shooting back and forth around the corners, and they're ducking and they're hiding and they're running up and down the stairs. And one of the shooters, you can see this very clearly, is carrying takeout food. And he never puts it down during this entire shootout. He's like running through the hallways and shooting around the corners, and he's got the takeout and he just keeps on moving. But you can see, knowing what we know about that particular case, that there are girls running down the hallway to get away from the shooting and that it was happening. So we have those 2 pieces of litigation here in Pennsylvania. And we know that there are also co-occurring crimes that go along with this, like kidnapping and false imprisonment. In addition, in the Middle District, the United States Attorney's Office has criminally indicted the corporate entity of a hotel along with the hotel manager. So there are ways to look at the hotel industry through both civil and criminal litigation. What does transports means? There is case law out of the Ninth Circuit, the Brooks case specifically, where a defendant was convicted under that act of transports. Yes, he was driving them around, but he was also purchasing them bus tickets and putting them on the bus. That constitutes transportation. I can tell you that in our Commonwealth, Secretary Richards and the Department of Transportation in Pennsylvania is a committed ally in the fight against both sex and labor trafficking. And Secretary Richards has really made it part of her mission that every single one of the over 16,000 employees at PennDOT is trained to recognize the signs of sex and labor trafficking. And she started off with the public face of the Department of Transportation, which is the DMV, making sure that everyone at the DMV knows how to recognize both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Maintains, what does that mean? It's also limiting the victim's access to transportation or communication with the outside world, and it's providing access to controlled substances. So the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, I told you guys the TVPA has been reauthorized several times, and in 2015, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act reauthorized the TVPA. And one of the reasons that the criminal code, section 1591, was amended to add in 3 additional acts of advertises, patronizes, and solicits is because Congress recognizes that this industry of sex trafficking is a demand-driven industry. And Congress added in those 3 words, advertises, to go after the internet, which is where it's the new street corner, quite frankly. But to go after internet service providers like Backpage.com, which has subsequently been seized by the federal government and is facing both civil and criminal litigation. But patronizes and solicits, because Congress, again, wanted to make it unequivocally clear that sex buyers are the reason this industry exists in the first place. And they did so after this Youngers case came down out of the 8th Circuit. The government moved on that act of obtains and prosecuted a sex buyer named Youngers. And he was convicted of buying as a trafficker because he was buying sex from a 14-year-old girl. So what do we know? We needed an act for the means, we need an act for the purpose of commercial sex, and we don't need the means of force, fraud, and coercion because the victim in that case was a child. So Youngers was convicted. We all know why courts get involved. It's to explain what the law means. And they said, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, no, we should not have been convicted. We're only sex buyers. We're not traffickers. Congress only meant this law to apply to traffickers, and we're just sex buyers. And the court was like, dude, you're wrong. Your convictions are upheld. And the court gave a hypothetical fact pattern, which said, what if a trafficker sells his 14-year-old child victim to a sex buyer for $1,000. That sex buyer takes the child and decides he wants to go to Vegas for the weekend. So they get in the car and they get on an airplane and they go to Vegas and they stay in a hotel, and that sex buyer's like, you know, I want to bargain for more sex, so every additional sex act I'm going to give you $100. And this child is like, okay. So they have their Vegas weekend and they get back on an airplane and he takes the child back to her pimp. So what acts has that sex buyer engaged in? How about transports? How about harbors? How about maintains? How about entices? Yeah, that's a sex buyer. It's not a trafficker. The law really does criminalize a broad spectrum of conduct here. And I'm not going to stand here and say every single sex buyer is a trafficker. That would be irresponsible for me. I think law enforcement and prosecutors really need to be very clear when they're using the trafficking statute to target sex buyers. And I think that they should do it when there are high-frequency sex buyers involved. Those guys who are in the chat rooms, like USA Sex Guides, like the League, like the review boards, raving about the human beings that they've purchased for sex, because what are they doing? This is basically like Yelp for sex buyers. What does Yelp do? It helps drive the market. And we know that some of these guys are spending between $30,000 and $50,000 a year buying sex. So I suggest that they use their resources to target them, and obviously those who are buying children for sex. The means: force, fraud, and coercion. Force is easy. Fraud, maybe, maybe not. Coercion is that psychological torture, but this Bell case out of the 8th Circuit makes it clear that that boyfriend type behavior, I love you, I'll take care of you, you have to prostitute to make us money, but I love you, that does constitute fraud. And again, the purpose is anything of value in exchange for a sex act. So that's the federal law. Do you guys have any questions? You're either really bored or I'm good at this. Okay, so Pennsylvania's law is Chapter 30 in our Crimes Code, and we refer to it as Act 105. It went into effect in September of 2014, and when we were advocating for this law, we were focusing on 3 primary areas: prosecution, prevention, and protection. We know that since the law went into effect in 2014, that there have been 27 convictions, 29 ongoing cases, and 14 cases that have turned from state into federal cases. We know that the first conviction didn't happen until February of 2016, and it happened in Lehigh County. I can also tell you that we don't currently, at this point, have any state case law on this. So that's why those federal cases are really important for us to look at as non-binding precedent, right? There are a couple cases up on appeal. One went up on sentencing, and the sentencing was upheld, but we have no case law to tell us what these acts mean, what the 13 factors that basically make up force, fraud, and coercion that I'm going to get to in a minute mean. We've got nothing. So prosecution, and this doesn't go backwards. There we go. Here's where it's codified. It's in sections 3011 to 25, but we have to actually look at the definition to start with, which is in 3001 of Title 18. Here's a map, you guys, just to show you exactly where we have criminal cases that have been brought in this state. So from east to west, from north to south, from rural to urban to suburban. So this is also in our report, which I have some of if you guys are interested in our 2018 or 2017, no, it was this year we did it. Our latest report on the 2017 numbers, which you can also find on our website, which is cseinstitute.org, about which counties have the most cases. Interestingly, the Lehigh Valley was one of the first of 5 counties, Lehigh County. So was Wayne County. And just to put things in perspective, Wayne County is up there on the northeastern part of our state. Guess how many common pleas court judges are in Wayne County? 1. So that can just tell you the rural nature, right, of that particular county. From the top of the county to the bottom of the county, it spans 100 miles. And there's only a population of 60,000. So again, very rural county, one of the first convictions, and the victim in that case was a child sex trafficking victim. Montgomery County, Philadelphia County, and Delaware County also. So it just goes to show you where it's happening throughout the state. Cambria County, also very rural. And just to touch a little bit on the hotel industry and how they can be a really good ally for us, that case in Cambria County came to the attention of law enforcement because the woman who was the manager of the hotel was working behind the front desk at night. And she heard these 2 men arguing in the lobby of the hotel. And it was the sex buyer arguing with the pimp over how much he had to pay, and she'd had some trafficking training. And 2 adult victims were recovered, and that case was successfully prosecuted and the guy sentenced. But yes, the transportation industry, the hotel industry have an opportunity to be criminalized, right? Or to be sued, but they also have a really great opportunity to be our allies and help stop this. So here's our definition in Pennsylvania. And it's right here in our definition that we know we're in line with the federal government. meaning that we don't have to get to those elements of force, fraud, and coercion. It's not an element of the crime if the victim is a child. But here's our definition of sexual servitude. It's any sex act or performance involving a sex act for which anything of value is directly or indirectly given, promised to, or received by any individual, or which is performed or provided by any individual, and is induced or obtained from a minor, or any of the means set forth in section 3012B. Our law actually doesn't say means of force, fraud, and coercion. It says the means set forth in section 3012B, and it gives us a list of 13 things to choose from. I think that we can take that list of 13 things and put them in those three categories of what constitutes force, fraud, or coercion. So here are acts, and I've already gone through all of the acts with you guys. We have all of the same acts that the federal law has, with the exception of two. We do not have patronizes, and we do not have advertises. I have repeatedly testified to our state legislature and written them and written reports and emailed them and called them on the phone and told them that we need to add those two in so that we can be in line with the federal government. But we know that we can still target sex buyers with that act of obtaining, with the act of soliciting, and if we have a sex buyer in Pennsylvania taking a kid to Vegas, all of those other acts that we talked about, okay? We also have the ability to go after those third-party facilitators that knowingly benefit financially or receiving anything of value from any act that facilitates any activity described in paragraph 1, right? So, hotels, transportation, strip clubs, we can do that. We know that our maximum penalty is between 5 and 10 years imprisonment. So we also know that it's a felony of the first degree, and section 3011B is our crime of trafficking children or trafficking in minors. We know that the maximum penalty for this is 10 to 20 years, and they added trafficking, specifically section 3011 and section 3012, to what constitutes to the list of what you, if you're convicted, if you have to register as a sex offender, okay? So here we have our means set forth in section 3012B. And I've divided them up and taken them out of order to put them in those three categories of what constitutes force, fraud, and coercion. But I think it's really clear just to let all of you know that someone who you may be working with, if you choose to engage in this vacature and post-conviction relief, what they may or may not have been through. This is where we can kind of get a gist of the torture and the traumatic experiences that these victims have survived and why it is that they're victims and shouldn't have criminal convictions in the first place. So force is easy, right? We can imagine this stuff. It's causing or threatening to cause serious harm to any individual. It's physically restraining or threatening to physically restrain another individual, and it's kidnapping or attempting to kidnap an individual. The legislature does say fraud. It doesn't expand on it. It just says fraud. So what do we know from federal case law? That boyfriend type behavior from that Bell case constitutes fraud. And I can tell you that almost every single one, and Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, every single survivor that we've worked with was defrauded in that way. I love you. Boyfriend behavior, that Romeo pimp bringing you in. I've had survivors say, like, I thought I was a victim of domestic violence and I just had to prostitute, like it was part of it. So that whole, like, you're gonna do this because we need to buy things and we're gonna eventually have a house with a white picket fence, and so that's what constitutes fraud, at least under federal case law. So coercion. It's abusing or threatening to abuse the legal process. And I've told you guys a little bit about the bottom, right? She probably has a child with her pimp. What do you think that he's doing with that child? I'm gonna call DHS on you. You're never gonna see that child again. I'm gonna call children and youth, right? It's threatening to abuse that legal process. I'm gonna report you. You're just a thief. You're just a dirty, and use any one of those words that is a synonym in society to prostitution, right? I'm going to call the police on you. Nobody's going to believe you. Taking or retaining their personal property or real property as a means of coercion. I worked with one client who had a bank account with trafficker's mom. And it was a joint bank account. They could both take money in and out, but it was her bank account. And she would put money in there. She thought she was saving to get things. And the trafficker would make his mom, or have his mom, who was really a co-conspirator in the trafficking, go in and clear out that bank account. She didn't have any recourse because it was a joint bank account. I've also heard from clients and survivors that we've worked with, he said I could leave anytime I wanted, but he owned all my clothes and all my shoes, right? Where was I supposed to go? I didn't have anything to wear that I owned that was my own. Engaging in unlawful conduct with respect to documents. People think this applies only to the documents of foreign nationals, but that's not the case. It's any state identification document. So if you're thinking about cases where trafficking is happening inside of hotels, do you think a trafficker is going to rent the hotel room in his name? No, of course not. He's going to rent it in the women's names, his bottom's name, other women in the stable, and he's going to hold their ID and not let them go. Extortion. We've seen this happen so much. If you don't do this, I'm going to take these pornographic photographs, this pornographic video, and I'm going to send it to the world. I'm going to send it to your mom, right? You have to continue to do this. Duress, through the use of or threat to use unlawful force against a person or another. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, if I didn't do it, he said he was going to take my little sister, or he knew where my mom lived. He was going to burn my mom's house down. Criminal coercion is already a crime in our crimes code, and if you read section 2906, it just tracks all of this same type of behavior. Debt coercion. And I've had this brought to my attention many times by criminal defense attorneys and also by victim services partners of ours in the state of New York. Foreign national gets arrested and charged with the crime of prostitution in a county. It's her first arrest. She's undocumented. Her bail is set at $10,000 cash. Who do you think pays the bail to get her out? Who do you think hires her criminal defense attorney? Then, because she's being trafficked on the circuit down from New York through New Jersey and Baltimore, and she has to come back to face those charges, who pays for her transportation back? The trafficker, and she racks up a debt. So I always encourage prosecutors and law enforcement to really dig and look at these cases, especially when you've got foreign nationals saying, no, I'm just doing this on my own. I highly doubt that. My favorite one is facilitating or controlling the individual's access to a controlled substance. And it's not my favorite one because that's what's used by traffickers. It's my favorite one because the legislature was thoughtful enough to recognize that we have a heroin epidemic nationally. And it's not just enough for traffickers to get their victims addicted or to supply them with heroin, but also how coercive and how horrific is it? We've all learned this, withholding it. We've learned that the brain chemistry has become so changed that that person going through withdrawal will do just about anything to not be sick, right? So withholding it can be just as powerful as getting someone addicted. And I always stop and think a little bit. We have victims that are dope sick, being purchased for sex in that dope sickness day in and day out. Who's buying sex from dope sick girls and women and boys and young men? Someone is, because it's a $150 billion worldwide industry. So we need to think about what we're going to tolerate as a society anymore. But I won't go on my policies shtick right now. We're just sticking to the law. And then finally, using any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the victim to believe that if the victim doesn't perform, in this case, the Commercial Sex Act, they or someone else is going to suffer harm or physical restraint. Again, I'll burn your mom's house down. We find our purpose in section 3012A, which again It's always a felony of the first degree if someone is using any of those 13 factors, if they're knowingly, through any of those means, subjecting an individual to labor or sex trafficking. I think this is funny, haha, not, kind of weird that the legislature threw in this little caveat, except where it's permissible under state law or federal law, because it doesn't exist. I'm like, oh, did you just do that to make yourselves feel better, just in case there's an exception, right? Okay. So that is the prosecution section of Chapter 30. So prevention of trafficking, you guys. We have seen over the last 4 years VOCA money flow into the state of Pennsylvania to the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency to be able to grant out money for organized funding, for victim services, for training, for public awareness campaigns, to train law enforcement and first responders, and for specialized programs. But it's been really hard because this law was passed without a fiscal note. But we're now seeing that grant money flow in, and people have been able to apply and successfully get money. Protection of victims is specifically Section 3019, which is why all of you are here today talking about vacatur and post-conviction relief and other protections like that civil remedy that I mentioned before. So here are our protections, right? Vacatur. There's an affirmative defense to the crime of prostitution if you were trafficked. There's its own rape shield built in. Post-conviction relief. A civil cause of action was created so sex trafficking survivors can sue those that made money off their victimization. There's a law enforcement mandate to identify, protect, and assist victims. They're eligible for crime victim services. They're eligible for specialized services, housing, placement. It all must be voluntary. So it was really thoughtful, good things were built into this. One of the things that you all also really need to understand in doing this space is understanding the crimes that the victims were convicted of during their time of victimization, which is why vacatur exists, and Sarah's going to explain all of that to you. But I want to talk to you guys about prostitution and what prostitution in our crimes code looks like. It's Section 5902 in our crimes code, and it actually is not just about the sale of sex. A is called prostitution. Okay, that's what you could be arrested and charged with and convicted of if you are prostituting, if you're selling sex or you're being sold for sex. B is called promoting prostitution. That's pimping, you guys. Promoting prostitution, B.1 is actually promoting prostitution of a minor. And promoting prostitution of a minor is sex trafficking kids. That's it. C is the grading. D is living off prostitutes. Yes, people, that's a crime in Pennsylvania. And E is patronizing prostitutions or buying sex. So here's A, and I'll give you guys my slides if you're interested. B, but I just want to point out some words in B, because B is really long. Owning, controlling, managing, supervising, or otherwise keeping, alone or in association with others, a house of prostitution, procuring, encouraging, inducing, soliciting, procuring, transporting. That language sounds familiar, doesn't it? And again, B.1, promoting prostitution of a minor. I've told the legislature a lot that they need to disaggregate this. B and B.1 need to be popped out of the prostitution section. They need to be lesser included offenses in Chapter 30. Here's our grading. Living off prostitutes. Who does this? Who lives off prostitutes? Yeah, traffickers. Which again, should be popped out and put in Chapter 30. And E, patronizing prostitutes. First of all, I hate the name of it. Let's just put this in the list of crimes against people instead of this obscenity section and call it what it really is. It's sexual exploitation of another person. Okay? So we understand that historically, and this is not a Pennsylvania or Philly issue, this is a national issue, that historically the way the commercial sex industry has been policed is by targeting for arrest and prosecution the prostituted person. And if I said, shout out the first word that comes to mind when I say that word prostitute, all of you have one of them, right? That synonym that immediately you think of. I was teaching a bunch of teenagers through the Philadelphia Police Department. It was the first time I learned the acronym THOUGHT, T-H-O-T. I was like, thought? I'm thinking that they were thinking. And I was like, what? It's that hoe over there. So they're stigmatized. And they've got things that are just thrown up as barriers in front of them, right? And why does prostitution exist? And this is an international, like we know these same things, right? When you're 6 years old, you don't think, when I grow up, this is what I want to do for a living. It's poverty. It's being marginalized. It's not being able to pay your rent. It's not being able to feed your kids. And society has basically normalized sex buying. And it's never been targeted, right? Until the last 5 years or so, when we've seen a real effort nationally to flip this script and engage in what's called either the Swedish model or the Nordic model or the equality model, but to turn that stigma that has been on that prostituted person and put it squarely where it belongs in the demand. Because we know that prostituted people need really robust social services, which is part of that equality or Nordic model, and exit strategies, not criminal convictions. And our statute does recidivize. The first couple of times, it's a misdemeanor of the third degree. The third or fourth, it's a misdemeanor of the second degree. And by your fifth conviction, you're facing state prison time for a misdemeanor of the first degree. Go to state prison for 5 years, right? For prostituting. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So that's why our legislature was really thoughtful and recognizing that we have people walking around in our Commonwealth that have criminal convictions that should have never had them in the first place because the crime was being committed to them, not by them. And it's given them this legal remedy of vacatur, which means that their conviction legally never happened in the first place, which is bigger than expungement. Here's just a disparity in our policing tactics in Pennsylvania, just for your information. We know that 10 out of 38 of our 67 counties that are policing the commercial sex industry focus on demand-driven operations. But we still know that it's policed about a quarter of a time compared to prostitution arrests.
So Shay already provided some of the learning objectives, of course, of the CLE, but the learning objectives, particularly within my section that I'm hoping I'll give you a snapshot of. All of these can really be trainings within their own right. So I won't be going super in depth into each of the topics, but of course we can give you lots more information on this if it's a practice you're going to be getting deeper into. So looking at pimp control and trauma bonding. Actually, before I do that, has anybody by a show of hands been to sort of a trafficking and trauma training where you've looked at pimping and trauma bonding and grooming? A few hands? Okay, so hopefully some of this will refresh that and maybe be even a new take on some of the understanding of trauma. I want to look particularly at the impact of trauma and briefly the neurobiology of trauma, and really I will not be doing that justice today in this training, so please know that. But there is really a very complex mind-body connection to the way in which trauma impacts one's memory, impacts the way in which stories are told, and how people narrate their trauma experiences. And the reason I want to focus a lot on that element of understanding the neurobiology of trauma and how it's impacted in one's brain and in one's memory is because that obviously impacts the way in which somebody explains their story when you're working with them and asking them to retell their story to you, or if you're coming alongside and advocating for somebody during a criminal justice process and the way in which they might retell their recent trauma, depending on how close it is to the time in which you're interviewing them, or if you're interviewing them 10 years later, right? So how does trauma get impacted and then filtered through a world of language? Because we ask people to narrate trauma through a world of language, and we're going to look at how trauma is often stored in a non-linguistic way within our bodies. And so there's a discrepancy and challenge in which our systems, rightfully so, require people to sort of get their story down on paper. And we're going to look briefly at parallel process. This is mostly just a shout out to Shay, because she really enjoys when we talk about parallel process and power dynamics. So I will get into that. And then practice tips. Okay, so before jumping into all of that, I want to give you a case example of pimping before talking about, and that will lead into this understanding of the pimp dynamic and sort of the trauma bonding that occurs between a pimp and his or her victims. This is just an example of a pimp that's being quoted that was prosecuted. He's saying it begins, and Shay mentioned this, so this ties into that fraud, that boyfriend stage, and this is very common. It begins with the boyfriend stage. He says, where pimps prey on vulnerable girls and pretend to be in love. Most of these girls, like I said, they're broken. It's not hard. You just got to answer their call. You get in there, you find the crack, like some are drugs, some are just, they need to hear I love you. But he added, it's all an illusion because there's no love in the sex trade. And then as you go down here, I won't read this whole thing, but the last paragraph, why? Because you just sold her a dream, so sort of why does she do it? He said he offers them protection and security, helps them upload their online sex advertisements, drives them to John's houses, pays their rent, and buys them anything they need, from food, tampons, hair dye, condoms, and sex toys. So it's sort of just the familial relationship that begins to be built between a pimp and a victim. So oftentimes we're looking for people to retell their story of the pimp. We might be, you might not, you might be more advanced than this, but sometimes because of the sensationalism of trafficking, we're sort of looking for the narrative to be this demonized individual that really victimized the person you're talking to, but they're more so talking about them in a loving way, in a familial way, like he had my back. When no one else was around, he was always there for me. And in a lot of ways that's true, right? So there's some validation of those feelings that has to happen without, of course, sort of, you're not going to promote those feelings, but you're also going to lose a lot of ground and rapport and trust with somebody if you demonize those feelings or those attachments to the trafficker. It's really all I'm going to go into that. There's a lot more we can unpack about that. This is another quote from a pimp that'll be relevant later when we talk about parallel process. But it's also going to feed into this idea of the pimp controlling and grooming tactics. So this is from an online pimp blog. There's also a book called Pimpology out there that's obviously very horrific and sold on Amazon, I think, right? Yeah, right now. Go get it delivered next day. So another thing I used to do all the time with my bitches is give them certain things they need to do so that you're always controlling their actions. If they're watching TV, it's because they've earned it and you've allowed it, not because it's their right to watch TV whenever they want. So remember this quote, particularly the end there. When they're watching TV, it's not their right. It's because you've allowed it. When we think about parallel process and power and control dynamics, who maintains and who wields the power? The folks that you're going to work with or survivors are coming from a life where the power was all held by the person who was controlling them, the trafficker. And so oftentimes as somebody's out of the life, there's a lot of challenges with authority. And there's a lot of challenges with power dynamics, right? Whoever holds that power, whether it's a judge in a courtroom who sort of holds the power over where they're going to go next, whether it's they're going to go to inpatient, they're going to get shipped upstate, they're going to get to stay home on house arrest, right? That power is not held by them. So once again, they feel like somebody else is controlling my daily life functions. And then when they're in programs, somebody else is once again controlling those daily life functions. But this is also I'm going to tie this into elements of control that are used in that the coercion factors that we talked about in the law. So what is trauma bonding? It's captivity which brings the victim into prolonged contact with the perpetrator and creates a special type of relationship, one of coercive control. The goal of the perpetrator is to instill in his victim not only fear of death, but also gratitude for being allowed to live, right? We've heard this frequently with the notion of Stockholm Syndrome and how sometimes hostage victims or individuals in situations, high intensity situations might also gain this gratitude to their captor for the times in which they feed them, they're nice to them, they build a relationship with them, or they, frankly, right, allow them to live, or maybe they save them from another person in the ring or in the stable who was going to abuse them. Maybe the trafficker prevents that abuse, and then they feel even more gratitude to the trafficker, who ultimately was the first one who got them there. But that sort of starts to become muddled and gray. And how that becomes gray, this is one great example I have found in looking at elements of coercion, particularly psychological coercion and how that gets broken down. in the pimp relationship. It's called Biederman's chart of coercion, and there's actually a third column if you pull up the chart that was adapted by Amnesty International. And it has 8 elements. And Biederman's chart of coercion actually was first coined and sort of put into definition, looking at the torture of prisoners of war by the Communist Party during the Korean War. And so these were looked at as elements that prisoners of war underwent during their captivity. Think of these same elements being used against a vulnerable individual who might be adolescent in age or even a young adult whose mind isn't even fully formed yet, right? Their brain, their emotional, their cognition is not even fully formed or might have even been stunted from early childhood trauma. So you take a vulnerable individual and you break them down using very tactful elements of coercion. It's no wonder that the victim did not leave or returned multiple times to the trafficker. Another thing that I want to point out about Biederman's chart of coercion is that almost all of the 8 elements have no physical marking in nature. So that threat, right, or the isolation, there's no marks that you're going to see on that person. So when you're trying to prove this and you're trying to narrate this point of the coercive control as it relates to the crimes code and the conduct of trafficking, there's no physical markings, so you have to get creative in how you're gonna explain that, of course. But the monopolization of perception, induced debility and exhaustion, and threats. A survivor that I've worked with, talked about, and I just recently had a survivor speak at an event, talked about how all of her trafficking was coercive in nature, and she almost never had physical markings from a trafficker. But he held a gun to her head. He never shot her, but he held a gun to her head, right? And she talked about, but if I walked out on the street, no one ever knew what was going on. She talked about living at home and sometimes going back home and seeing her family, and all the while, she was in college at the time, and no one knew she was being trafficked because of how powerful the psychological control and threats were that maintained her silence and complicity. These are the other 4. So occasional indulgences, those are the times where the pimp, lets her watch TV. Or in that first quote from the trafficker where he talks about you just find out whatever the crack is, whatever the vulnerability is, whatever the weakness is, and then you manipulate that. And you ensure that you exploit it, right? So if it's dangling, there's another great quote from this Pimpology and Pimp blog talking about dangling a carrot in front of her head. So figuring out whatever it is, whatever the dream is that you need to sell for that individual, whether it's she's always wanted the family, she's always wanted a house, she's always wanted to make sure that she had food again on the table because she grew up in poverty or in hunger. And so you find whatever that is and you make sure that you fulfill that need, you meet that need. And then you use that against that person. Also, the occasional indulgences are getting their hair done, by getting their nails done, and making sure that they're cared for. Because right when the system rips all that away, and they get recovered maybe in a sting operation, they lose, right, their clothes that they liked, their fashion, their cell phone, and they feel like I've been stripped away of everything, sort of the material possessions that I liked, and those were really important to me. And now I'm in this group home where I don't have any cool clothes, I don't have a cell phone anymore, I can't buy the products that I liked, and at least when I was in the life, he provided all that for me, right? And of course there's distortions there, but it's gonna take a really long time and in therapy to sort of play those out. Demonstrating omnipotence, degradation, and then enforcing those trivial demands. So that develops that habit of compliance. Which is why people ask, why didn't you leave? Or why didn't you call the police? And Shay often says this when she trains, if somebody breaks into your house, what's the first thing you're gonna do? Call 911, you're gonna call the police. But when an individual is being trafficked, we always say this, they don't self-identify as a victim because of this psychological nature of control. Okay, so that's sort of looking a bit at the pimp control and trauma bonding. And I'm gonna move into briefly the trauma theory side of this. So how does all of these elements of coercive control and the elements of abuse, whether it's through physical restraint or psychological in nature, how does this impact individuals sort of in a neurobiology type of way? But recognizing that we are connected to our mind, so there's a mind-body connection to what happens up in our brain from the experiences that we have of fear, and abuse. So we're going to look at the body's fear response, how this impacts the loss of identity formation. So there's a significant loss of one's sense of self. And there's a significant loss of trust in oneself and in the world. So people don't even trust themselves, right, to make decisions or to be safe in the world. The hypervigilance and hypo-arousal of the nervous system that you'll see, and that will play out, right, in when you meet with clients or when they don't show up to meetings or when they lash out in rage and then they get kicked out of a program and you thought that you were capable of working with them, but now they're on the streets again. What happened there? So briefly, the body's stress response, this is sort of just biology 101, fight, flight, or freeze. You all remember this, right? So in fight, flight, or freeze is our body's most basic response to protecting ourselves when we feel some sort of fear stimulus. So if the fire alarm went off in this building right now, all of you we might have different reactions, right? So those of you who might be really used to having it go off routinely, you become sort of desensitized. So your heart rate might not become that elevated. You might briefly for a second turn on. You might sense danger, but quickly your thinking brain checks it out. You don't smell smoke. You go right back to normal functioning. If there's no danger, you go back to that normal functioning. So, however, if there is danger, our thinking brain shuts down and allows our doing brain to react. So in the event that the fire alarm went off, and then you all of a sudden started to see smoke billowing under the doors, you'll continue to stay in this your body will secrete hormones that will be released by your amygdala and sending message to your body's sensory system to react, right? You won't necessarily keep thinking about this presentation. You won't continue whatever conversation you were just having where you were using logical reasoning, you were talking, you were maybe future planning what you were going to do after this event, what you're going to do when you go home tonight. That's going to be inhibited and sort of shut down, right? In an emergency situation, do you ever find yourself thinking anymore, future planning? No, you're in the moment. You're present. Your heart's beating faster. You might have butterflies in your stomach. Your lungs, you're breathing stronger. Your body's getting prepared to do whatever it has to do to protect itself. And these are great causal effects that help to keep us safe in life-threatening situations. But the problem is when the body's alarm system goes off too frequently, people's bodies become unbalanced. And that's what's happening when folks are being trafficked. They're constantly operating in this fear state. Their environment in and of itself is a fear stimulus. Being in that hotel room when a stranger walks in, they're on alert, right? They're not calm. They're not getting ready for a romantic date, right? They're getting ready to make sure they don't get strangled by that date, that he doesn't pull out a knife and want to have some sort of violent sex play. And that happens. So they're in that rage. So we often think too that the individual is threatened by the pimp, but they're also threatened in a daily state by the buyers. And whether it's in a hotel or an open air track on the street's not a safe place, right? You get robbed on the street, you get beat up. So the survivors of trafficking are coming from an existence where they're having this ongoing exposure to their fight-flight system. I'm going to get more into this as we look at some content from a really renowned trauma researcher, Bessel van der Kolk, but this is a great quote from him in terms of how trauma gets stored when our fight or flight system is going off. So our fight or flight system is an automatic response, right? You don't have control over that, which is why we sort of see people's true colors. If you came from a war zone, for example, or a place in which you had experienced a lot of ongoing traumatic environmental threats and a fire alarm went off, your reaction or somebody's heart rate reaction might be very different than somebody else who grew up in a safe environment, never experienced a house fire, never had bombs thrown off over their head, right? They might remain calm in this audience when that alarm goes off versus somebody who has experienced that. Similarly, folks who have experienced sexual trauma are going to have a lot of trauma triggers that we have to be aware of when we're working with them. And this is key here, and this is what we'll look at next. Because the stress response disrupts general information processing, survivors of trauma live in a somatic world rather than a world of language. And that's why it's so challenging to sometimes get individuals, survivors of this trauma, to narrate their story in a world of language, or to ask survivors of trauma to go to talk therapy. We find a lot of challenges, and sometimes it works really well and sometimes it doesn't, but it's because our trauma is often stored in a sensory nature, and those also become the hallmarks of flashbacks. That's why when people smell something, smell a cologne, you walk by and a whiff of a cologne or a perfume takes you back, right? Either to a good experience or to a really bad experience. If you smell a cologne or a perfume of an ex and somebody else is wearing it, you sort of have maybe this nasty feeling in your stomach of like, wait, why am I feeling this way? And you have associations in your sensory system with experiences. And so this is similar for sexual trauma. Oh, I switched slides without knowing it. But that's okay. So this is also what we're talking about. So when danger is ever present, folks' alarm goes off too frequently. Individuals begin to treat all potential threats as actual threats. So that's that overreaction. You sometimes feel like people react to a situation in an emotional way that doesn't match whatever was going on. Has that ever happened for you with clients in general, clients who have experienced trauma, not maybe just trafficking? And this is sort of another way of looking at why that occurs. There's going to be two charts here in sort of looking at arousal. So these are your sympathetic hyperarousal and parasympathetic hypoarousal. So normally, this is where all of us right now in this room are probably operating within. We're in this window of tolerance. The feelings that you're experiencing right now can be tolerated, and you're able to think and you're able to feel. And that's because whatever's going on, like the door opening, something drops, somebody's cell phone goes off, all of those stimulus really just kind of bring you up, but bring you back down, but you maintain a level of homeostasis. And that allows your frontal cortex, your thinking portion of your brain, which isn't fully developed until around 25 years of age, 25, 26 in general, but it allows you to think and future plan and decision making. This is sort of the automatic body's adaptation. So our automatic, we don't have control over this. It's automatically done for us by our body's systems when we become unbalanced by compound and complex traumatic experiences. Our nervous systems, our sympathetic, sort of become stuck on. That's that hyperactivity, that panic, rage, hypervigilance that you see. And then our parasympathetic becomes stuck off, hypoarousal. And the depression, disconnection, deadness, and exhaustion. So folks that don't answer their phone, one day they're right on point, they're making everything done that you need them to get done, and then the next day you don't hear from them, and they say, oh, I just slept through the appointment, I was too exhausted to get up. Or I missed court because I was just too tired. They're disconnected, there's this deadness and exhaustion, particularly as folks transition out of the life or out of a situation of trauma. You start to see these two systems that have been maxed out for such a prolonged period of time really displaying these symptoms. And it's not that people cannot get back into that window of tolerance, but folks who have experienced a lot of traumatic stress, our bodies adapt. All that over-release of chemicals have sort of created an imbalance within one's sense of being. Okay. So the next section of this is something new that I'm looking forward to trying out. So you're my guinea pigs in this room. I wanted to find maybe a new way, because I also got sick of hearing myself say the same thing, of describing trauma and the neurobiology of trauma. And so we talked a little bit about just how trauma sort of originates and inhibits our frontal lobe and our language portion of our brain. And it's often stored in our sensory system. And so in those 5 senses, so sometimes folks will more relate to the sensation of touch and how the person might have punched them, or how their body felt pressed against them, or how they strangled them. They relate more to describing their experience in a sensory nature than maybe in a linear context. Folks will try to put the story together, but that's when we get those challenging fact patterns where things change over time, and it's because folks try to create the story that they think you might want to hear, or that they think makes sense. But as you'll hear described by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a renowned trauma theorist and researcher. He started the Trauma Center out of Boston, and he's done a lot of original research on mind-body connection, particularly as it relates to trauma. So we're going to listen to some interview clips with him talking about trauma and how that gets stored in the body and how his research has been impacted by understanding this. But I've highlighted, I've taken, because it's an audio clip and I don't want you to zone out listening to his voice, I've put up his script as he's talking, and I've highlighted portions of it that I wanted to talk about as it relates to particularly trauma-informed lawyering and interviewing survivors of trauma. Okay, so I'm going to read this quote first. I did not include this in audio. This is him talking about, and this relates to trafficking. So he's talking globally about trauma, but I'm going to relate it particularly to the challenges of working with survivors of trafficking and that type of trauma. He's talking here particularly about nightmares. The first person I saw was a Vietnam veteran. This is in the beginning of his career when he worked at the VA, who had terrible nightmares. I happened to have studied nightmares up to that point and some sleep studies, and I knew a bit about how to treat it. So I gave him some medicine to take for the nightmares to go away. Survivors of trafficking are often prescribed medication to minimize nightmares, and I can tell you from running a residential program, one of the biggest challenges is nighttime routines for survivors. And many of them talk about not wanting to go to sleep at night because they don't want to have to relive their nightmares every single time they go to bed. 2 weeks later, he came back and said, "So how did the medicines work?" And he said, "I did not take your medicines because I realized I need to have my nightmares because I need to be a living memorial to my friends who died in Vietnam." And that statement was the opening of my fascination about how people become living testimonials for things that no longer exist. But they need to hold it in their hearts and minds and bodies and brains. The loyalty to the dead, the loyalty was what just blew me away. So bear with me. Just going to turn the sound up here, and I'll get the words up for those of you that like to follow.
I think
Ooh,
happens
is that
that people have terrible experiences, and we all do, and we are a very resilient species. So if we are around people who love us, trust us, care us, nurture us when we are down, most people do pretty well with even very horrendous events. But particularly traumas that occur at the hands of people who are supposed to take care of you, if you're not allowed to feel what you feel, know what you know, you might not what goes on, and you can get stuck on the situation. So the social context in which it occurs is fantastically important.
Something that's very interesting to me in how you talk about trauma, the experience of trauma, what it is how the nature of memory is distorted. That memories are not precise recollections, but that in general, as we move through the world, memories become integrated and transformed into stories that help us make sense. But that when, in the case of traumatic memories, they're not integrated and they're not even really remembered.
That's correct. That's actually a very old observation that was made extensively in the 1890s already by various people, including Freud. And that's really what you see when you see traumatized people. Now, these days, now the trauma is a popular subject. People say, "Tell me about your trauma."
Right.
But the nature of our trauma is that you actually have no recollection for it as a story, in a way. Many victims over time tend to tell a story to explain why she messed up. But the nature of a traumatic experience is that the brain doesn't allow a story to be created. And here you have an interesting paradox, that it's normal to distort your memories. Like, now, I remember out of 5 kids, when we have a family reunion, we all tell stories about our own childhood.
Yeah.
And everybody always listens to everybody else's stories. And did you grow up in the same family as I did?
My version.
All these very, very different versions, and they barely ever overlap. So people create their own realities in a way.
Mm-hmm.
What is so extraordinary about trauma is that these images or sounds or physical sensations don't change over time. And so people who have been molested as kids continue to see the wallpaper of the room in which they were molested, or these, when they examine all these priest abuse victims, they keep seeing the silhouette of the priest standing in the door of the bathroom and stuff like that. And so it's these images, these sounds that don't get changed. So it's normal to change. My old teacher, George Valiant, did a study that you may have heard about. It's called the Grant Study. And from 1939 to 1942, they followed the classes at Harvard every 5 years, and it's going on to this day. Most of them went off to war in 1942, and almost all of them came back in 1945 and they were interviewed. And then they have interviews in 1989, 1990, 1991. And it turns out that the people who did not develop PTSD, which is the vast majority, tell very different stories, let's say in 1990, than back in 1945. And so it now is a glorious experience, it was a growth experience, and how cool it was, how close they were to people, and how patriotic we felt. And it's all sort of cleaned up.
Right, but it's become a coherent narrative.
But it's very coherent, yes. And it's a nice story, and it's good to listen to it, and relatives have all heard it a million times.
Right.
And because we make happy stories in our mind. People who got traumatized continue to have the same story in 1990 as they told back in 1945.
Right.
And so they cannot transform it. So if we treat people, when we treat people, you see the narrative change. And people start introducing new elements. I compare it very much to what happens when people dream. Maybe dreaming is very central here, actually, in that the natural way in which we deal with difficult stuff is we go to sleep and we dream, and the next day we feel better. It's very striking, how we get upset and then say, I go to move to Florida, a bomber day, and Boston in the winter. And the next morning you wake up and you shout out, everything's fine. So sleep is a very important way in which we restore ourselves, and that process of that restoration that occurs during REM sleep, dream sleep, is probably an important factor in why traumatic memories do not get integrated.
And also that gets at the fact that it's not just cognitive, right? It's not just a story that you could tell. I mean, it may eventually become a story, but that it's body memory. It's there is a neural net of memory. Yeah. It's not just about the words that you can formulate.
It's amazing to me what a hard time many people I know have with it. This is not about something you think or something you figure out. This is about your body, your organism, having been reset to interpret the world as a terrifying place, and yourself as being unsafe. And it has nothing to do with cognition, with, you can say to people, you shouldn't feel that way, or you're not a bad person, or it wasn't your fault. And people say, I know that, but I feel that it is.
Right.
It was very striking in our yoga study, because we see yoga as one important thing that helps people who've been traumatized because they get back into their bodies.
Yeah.
And how hard it was for people to, even during the most blissful part of the yoga practice called Shavasana, what a hard time traumatized people had at that moment to just feel relaxed and safe and feel totally enveloped with goodness. And that sense of goodness and safety disappears out of your body, basically.
I want to...
Well, what I think happens is that people have terrible experiences, and we all do. And we are a very resilient species, so if we are around people who love us, trust us, take care of us, and nurture us when we're down,
It's redone. Sorry about that. Okay. I want to point out a few things before playing a secondary clip here that's a bit shorter. It's only a minute. But I want to point out particularly as it relates to trafficking. So the social context in which it occurs is very important. So a lot of traumatic experiences by those who have been trafficked are sort of interpreted by those around them. So trafficking becomes, right, as Shay mentioned, trafficking can occur in a family. And we've had many folks who have been trafficked first encounter their trafficking scenario by an aunt, an uncle, or a mom, or a father or stepfather who might be selling the child early on for a substance abuse addiction or for whatever other reason. This one about sleep. So I want to point out, in case you did not notice, that it's probably an important factor in why traumatic memories do not get integrated. So sleep is very challenging for those who are survivors of trauma and survivors of trafficking, and so they do not have that restoration time where they wake up the next day and the reset button has occurred for them and life is all better. They continue to often relive and re-experience a lot of the trauma triggers that were very present the day before. Okay, so this is the final clip that we'll talk about, and looking at memory particularly.
Are we learning, or is any of this
What we
surprising?
see is that the parts of the brain that help people to think clearly and to observe things clearly really get interfered with by trauma. And the imprint of trauma is in areas of the brain that really have no access to cognition. So it's in an area called the Redaction of Dr. Gray, which has something with the sort of total safety of the body. The amygdala, of course, which is the smoke detector, alarm bell system of the brain. That's where the trauma lands, and trauma really makes that part of the brain hypersensitive, or renders it totally insensitive.
And the Broca's area?
Well, in our study and some others, I mean, for me that was really the great finding early on, is that when people are into their trauma, Broca's area shuts down. And that is something that almost everybody has experienced. That when you get really upset with your partner or your kid, suddenly you take leave of your senses and you say horrible things to that person, and afterwards you say, oh, I didn't mean to say that. Well, the reason why you said it is because Broca's area, which is sort of the part of your brain that helps you to say reasonable things and to understand things and articulate them, shuts down. So when people really become very upset, that whole capacity to put things into words in an articulate way disappears.
Right.
And for me, that's a very important finding, because it helped me to realize that if people need to overcome the trauma, we need to also find methods that bypass what they call the
What are we learning? Isn't it a surprise?
What we see is that the parts of the brain that help people to think.
Okay. So really here, he's pointing out the Broca section is in the frontal cortex of the brain. It's a subsection of the frontal cortex, and it's the area that houses specifically language. And so we have to overcome this tyranny of language. And so of course that's a challenge, because we retell people's stories and we advocate them through a world of language. So how can we sort of look at that and do that in the best way possible? So trauma theory suggests that many of the behavioral symptoms that we see in individuals are a direct result of coping with adverse experiences and what we identify as maladaptive behaviors, those behaviors that get folks in trouble with the law, that might get them caught up in the criminal justice system, are misapplied survival skills. They're things that folks did to protect themselves at the time that they were in that situation. And so we look at telling the story of how somebody might have gotten into a situation where, well, there's the small stuff. They were they were maybe carrying drugs for their trafficker, and they get arrested and then charged with that. So maybe not telling on their trafficker and saying, oh, these aren't my drugs. Maybe saying that is not an option, because they know that there's consequences when they get released if they tell the truth of where that came from. Or they break and enter into some property by their trafficker, making them go and do that. They shoplift. Or they get engaged in various, colluding in various crimes at the hands of their trafficker that force them to do it under duress. And that's very common, and I can tell you about a number of cases where we've worked with victims who were forced to do pretty horrible criminal acts under duress, right? Similar to situations where we think of child soldiers, where a child soldier might be forced to, commit a horrible act against their family or against friends because they've seen what happens if they don't comply. So we need to be the voice in understanding this point when we're working with survivors. We also need to understand reenactment and re-victimization that often occurs, so this cycle of relapse, and understand why that occurs. So when folks ask you, why did the client or the survivor go back to their trafficker multiple times? Why did they return to the life after having that gap period that Judge Neifield talked about? And so the cycle of re-victimization is very real for somebody who has been traumatized, particularly from early childhood. And so we understand that folks are sort of adaptive. And so when somebody's experienced early childhood trauma, which 80 to 90% of survivors of CSE have had some form of early childhood trauma, abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, or domestic abuse in the home, or they've resulted in a runaway or in the foster care system. And so they have a lot of these vulnerabilities that we already know of. And early on, that individual might not have had what the clip talked about in the beginning, loving, caring, trusted adults around them to process that trauma. So they find a way to reorganize that experience in their mind and rationalize it and normalize it to cope. So a child who's molested every day and doesn't ever get a chance to speak out against that abuse finds a way of rationalizing and normalizing that abuse. And what happens is human beings are adaptive. So children adapt to adversity by changing their definition of normal. And human beings resist changing anything that comes to feel normal. And this is sort of why we see that repetition and cycle of abuse, particularly in domestic violence scenarios, where we find that certain folks are prone to a pattern of abusive relationships. They're drawn to that nature of understanding love. And we see individuals who come from homes where maybe there was domestic abuse or there was extreme controlling and jealousy behavior at the hands of their parent's partner. And so they start to see when they go to meet a partner, well, if he doesn't threaten to beat me up because I don't give him my phone, then maybe he doesn't really love me. Because if he loved me, he would want to hurt me to find out, to make sure that I'm not cheating on him. There's almost this craving for understanding love in this way that it's been distorted. And that's just one example. But folks kind of grow up and get conditioned into understanding how they define love and how they define family and what's normal. And they resist changing that. And similarly, the grooming tactics of traffickers, depending on how long someone's been in the life, that becomes the new normal for that individual. And so when you rip them out of the life through a sting or through a program, they might return to their trafficker numerous times before successfully exiting the life. And that's because in those beginning stages, their normal is still the life. And sometimes, even though to us it's a lot safer and not scary outside that life, but we resist changing anything that's familiar to us, even if it's not that safe. Long work weeks, excessive work weeks, all of us have sort of adapted to this as the new normal, and we resist cutting back down because we think that there's no way to now fit our schedules into a normal 40 hours. So it has to be 60, it has to be 80. That becomes the new normal. And we don't want to go back to, if somebody says, turn your phone off at 5 p.m., turn it off on the weekend, if you feel like you're almost going to have more anxiety than if you just worked all weekend long. Right? So it's similar thought processes or patterns to thinking about the re-victimization of trauma, although that's a very extreme metaphor. I don't want to minimize the trauma. So how does this impact and look, once again, in survivors? There's a lot of impairment of affect regulation. So sometimes folks are also expecting a victim when they're telling their story to show more affect. You're expecting them to cry. Sometimes in a courtroom, I know we've had experiences where survivors are not emotive about their experience. They might even laugh a little, but and they get misconstrued as maybe this didn't really happen. Maybe this isn't as bad as your social worker or as whomever is describing it is, because you should be crying. Or we have this expectation of how the victim should present, because we're used to how other victims of assault or rape present when they tell their story. And so we're looking to kind of parallel that with victims of trafficking. And I can tell you that you might get that, but you also might get nothing similar. And to be prepared to advocate as to why that is. Somatization, so there's sometimes physical symptoms from a psychological effect. So sometimes survivors repeatedly go to the ER every single night when they're in an aftercare program, saying they have, maybe they're vomiting every single night, or they're saying that they're having a heart attack, right? And they get evaluated medically, and there's no defined medical issue. And oftentimes what we find is there's a psychological effect, somatization, of the trauma playing out in the body sensations. Alterations in self, distorted relations with others, so there's a lot of mistrust, so don't be surprised if folks mistrust you, try to manipulate you, whatever it might be. None of that is personal. It's relation to the world and to oneself that gets misconstrued. How it impacts our work, we just talked about this, so I'm going to jump over this slide. So we want to shift our perspective when we think about what it means to our traditional sense of how we look at people and how being trauma-informed should look. And so traditional looks at people as broken, vulnerable, they're damaged, we need to protect them, and agencies and all of us are out there to sort of fix the problem. But trauma-informed shifts our focus and believes that understanding providing clients with the maximum level of choices, autonomy, self-determination, dignity, and respect is central to healing, philosophy of holistic healing and resilience. And so these are nice terms, they're fluffy, and we might just breeze past them, but I really want to point out that in the line of working with survivors of trafficking, these are not just fluffy social work terms, self-determination, autonomy, choice. These are crucial for engaging with somebody successfully, because these have been the essence of the controlling dynamic and coercive controlling relationship that the trafficker and pimp used. He took away self-determination. He took away autonomy and choice. So in our system, do I put a parallel? I do. I'm happy that I put parallel process here. So when our system looks similar to the pimp dynamics, we clash with clients. And if we don't recognize how to help, so you might not be the system. You might not represent a system that has to house a survivor, or that has to put a survivor in detox or recovery or in confined detention. But if you can understand those dynamics, you can advocate within the system as to maybe why that survivor is acting out in the way that they're acting out. So this is not to, sometimes this can come off really offensive. I'm not trying to compare our systems to pimps, because I think the intentions of both are quite different, and that's really crucial, right? The system's intentions of wanting to keep folks safe are good, right? And they're there for a reason and a purpose. But we do need to think about how they look very similar sometimes in the eyes of victims and survivors. They look similar to the ways in which their pimp treated them. And you'll hear it when you really listen to how a survivor is reacting in situations. So pimping, right, confinement, isolation, physical contact, control over daily life, threats, no choice in the plan. Look over here at the system. Sometimes we put people in secure facilities. They feel isolated. Blackout periods. Go to this program, it's going to be great, it's going to heal you, it's going to be wonderful. But to that victim, they feel isolated. I have no contact. You take away my phone. I can't leave for 30 days. They run during that time because they'll think, I was just too overwhelmed. I was too overwhelmed. And what's going on too, right, is that regulation in their body and the sense of feeling like there's still no choice in the plan. Forced to do certain services in order to get their children back. Maybe it's obtain permanent housing. And there has to be policies, right? So the next slide here talks about finding balance. So we can't make the system completely choice given, but we do need to recognize the power dynamics that are inherent that we ask people to walk through. Even in vacator processes, what are the power dynamics in that? And how can we openly talk about that with survivors? The last one here I want to point out and that we need to be mindful of is this idea of rewards promised based upon compliance. And so how do we ensure that we're not re-exploiting individuals or creating this dynamic where the focus is on getting a reward and avoiding consequence versus authentic healing, authentically choosing to do something because it's good for my future. Not because if I don't do it, X, Y, and Z is going to be my punishment. So you can apply that to a number of settings because oftentimes we sort of also dangle a carrot out in front of clients, similarly to how the pimp dangled something out in front of them that they wanted to get them to do what they want, and they feel like, well, now the system's just telling me, they just want me to do it for them. I've heard clients talk about how FBI, who works wonderfully with survivors, and in their all best efforts, a victim is still saying, after an interview with FBI agents having to retell their story, which they went into, I want to talk, I want justice. They come out, they're just using me. They're just using me for my story. They just want to get their conviction. They don't care about me. And so there's this sense of, I don't want to be used anymore. I don't want to be re-exploited. I want my voice. But just to recognize they're in that tension, and sometimes the best we can do is just let people be. And to just be with them in their frustration through that and be consistent and demonstrate that I'm not just here to use you. This is not about me, right? This is about you. And bringing it back to that is really important. And you being consistent as the professional is really crucial for them not feeling like, because the first time you start to be inconsistent or you demonstrate that, they say, oh, yep, told you. You just wanted me for my story. Or if we threaten them, all of a sudden things get hard, they don't show up for a few appointments, so then we threaten them, and we think that might get them there, but sometimes I've seen just that there's a much worse reaction, they run away, because they feel like, oh, see, I told you, you're just going to threaten me to get what you want. And that's what I'm used to, and I know how to deal with people like you. Yeah.
Jamie, isn't that the crux of what we term victim-centered prosecutions? Meaning, if it's their choice to participate, the prosecution can be more successful, and in this space, it transfers into if they're choosing to move forward with the legal process to help them, then they'll engage more.
Yeah, so if it's their choice, if it follows sort of their timeline, their ability to continue, then you find that folks are more ready to come. Or if you let them have that blowout, and I've seen agents do this, the survivor blows up out of the room and they don't push them to talk, they don't push them to come back. They wait, they allow some steam to blow off and maybe a week or two to come, and then the survivor does maybe turn around at some point. They start to think about it differently again, and maybe they don't think that the agent is out to get them. Maybe it wasn't just about the agent, and maybe it really was about me and what I said at first. Yeah, so allowing for that space. Yeah, that's great, thanks, Shay. So this is just a great quote about kind of summing up the idea of parallel process and this notion. So in this way, our systems inadvertently but frequently recapitulate the very experiences that have proven to be so toxic for the people we are supposed to help. So how do, I think the big takeaway here is how do we be mindful to try to, in our best efforts to not re-engage in this process, or to question ourselves if we find that the process might be mirroring some of those power and control dynamics, and talking about it openly with a survivor. I had a survivor in our residential program say to me, "You're just like my pimp." And here, we have this PowerPoint where I think I'm getting it right and I'm not being just like your pimp, and I'm like, gosh darn it, like how did that happen? How is this, And so we talked about it. Why do I feel like your pimp? Why did what we just do make you feel like we're acting like your pimp? And so I think engaging and confronting that conversation is important. And there's a real challenge here, it could be a choice versus safety, but I want it to be choice and safety, because that's the big tug that you often hear between the victim service provider world and law enforcement world, is thinking about how do we keep these folks safe who we know might be engaging in very risky behavior if they return to their trafficker, because you just said they might return multiple times. So how do I make sure that they don't die the second time they go back, and how am I going to see them next time? And I don't have enough time nor a full answer to that right now, but I do want to raise that question to you, that there's this tension, and we should resist to the extent possible, not just always erring on the side of safety. I have to do this for safety, because we can damage folks, right? And there's a lot of other precedents where we allow choice and self-determination for folks that return to unsafe situations. Think of the domestic violence world. And officers that show up at a house call from a neighbor that called in and said that they hear a dispute, and if that woman chooses not to speak and to send those officers away, they don't handcuff her and say, well, you need to be safe, so we're taking you and we're locking you down. So rethinking and looking at some practice tips, understanding this notion of the stages of change. I've touched briefly upon this, so I won't go more in depth, but just that there's a process. It's not linear. It's not like people enter, they first enter pre-contemplation for change, or they contemplate change and then they take it, and then all of a sudden they are at action and maintenance and they're out of the loop. No, there's relapse. And then I love this image because people might enter back at any point in that stage of change. They don't all start back at the beginning. Folks might relapse and start back the next time at action. They might go right back to detox, right? And then they'll maintain it. And maybe they relapse again. And maybe they go back to contemplation because they're a little ticked off that they screwed up again that time. But I think recognizing whenever folks go back and say and express that readiness for change again, being there to champion it and to be strength-based and not negative in your language. Recognize that, hey, you're back here today. That's a great success. Let's not look at this as a setback. Let's just look at it as today is the start of your new future. So not always dwelling on the fact that there was failure at one point, but we're moving forward and you came back and that's a success. So these are some practice tips in terms of just our context here today. Allow for that self-determination and autonomy. Be aware of assuming that clients ought to change. Be aware of assuming that the client wants change. Be aware of assuming that the client's notion of safety is the same as yours, because folks' understanding of what is normal is very different than our understanding of what is normal and safe. And be aware of believing that the client does not choose to change or implement a behavioral change, that whatever intervention or whatever work that you're doing with them has failed in some capacity. Refrain from language that has the victim pleasing or performing for you. So that sometimes we say that even inadvertently in different ways. Do it for me, do this for me, and I'm going to check in with you next week. But not having them doing it for you, because continuously reminding that survivor, and this is what Shay was talking about, victim-centered, that it's about them. You're not doing this for me. This actually has no bearing on my life. if you choose to stick with this or not. And I've said that to survivors, what should I do, this or that, or I don't want to let you down, or I don't want to let the detectives down because I promised I'd go into detox, but I'm just not ready. It's like, well, and talking through that, but it's not for us. It has no bearing on my life if this person goes to detox. So really emphasizing that it is about them. It's about the victim. Understand how trauma experiences are stored in the mind and body connection, and that's how people are going to talk about those from time to time, and how we ask questions and reframe those can be helpful in the answers that we get. Understand trauma bonding and how survivors might talk about their relationship with their trafficker. So the language that they might use to describe their trafficker, you might have to explain the context for why that language at one point might have been really romantic or kind versus demonizing or abusive, and really explaining all the things that they did to them. And that might change over time. Survivors may not remember all of their arrests or details surrounding arrests, and Sarah will probably get into this, and they may appear with flat affect or be unable to recall events chronologically. Do not misinterpret the evasiveness as lying, but be honest and go back later, and Sarah will probably talk a lot more in depth about that practice tip. So be mindful. I want to talk briefly about this too. Be mindful of your body language, verbal and nonverbal reactions to survivors' stories. How you react to their story might change drastically how they continue to talk to you. So if you react really shocked to something they are telling you, or you might cry, or you feel like something was wrong, that can inhibit how that person continues to tell. Sometimes survivors have said, oh, you don't want to hear this, it's too much for you. Or they want to protect you because they feel like their story is too bad. And there's already inherent in trafficking this intense sense of shame, and shame keeps people from talking. And so our reaction can really influence how ashamed how that shame plays out for that person as they speak it out loud, and as they have to re-narrate that. So making them feel unashamed. When you go to the doctor's office, if they're super comfortable during, let's say you're going for a physical exam and the doctor seems a little bit hesitant talking about your body parts or about sex, or if they're talking to your kids and they don't seem super comfortable talking about sex in the person's body, the person in that doctor's room might not open up and talk as candidly because they feel a little uncomfortable. And so it's really important that we present very comfortable with the content that we're asking somebody to unpack. So be comfortable discussing taboo areas with a person. And maintain boundaries, define your role, where it starts, where it ends for somebody, and where you can refer them if it's outside your role. So if somebody's having a psychotic break or disassociation, finding ways to connect them with services that are within that expertise to help them more. And monitor their expectations, be clear, consistent, and implement concrete plans and next steps and timelines. This is really helpful, particularly with clients that are not used to future thinking or future planning, and or have a lot of anxiety in terms of the process, to be really clear as to what that process is and what the timeline is going to look like, so that they don't feel as frustrated or discouraged as it plays out. Because if they have a sense of what that looks like, then there's some expectations when they're waiting a long time to hear back, or you haven't followed up yet. And be yourself. So if something is hard for you, that's okay. You don't have to fake it and say that it's not hard, but find a way to be authentic. Maybe ask to take a break. Allow for the survivor to take a break if you also notice that they need to step out of the room while they're talking. Understand that survivors might get triggered as you are interviewing them, and that could look like disassociation. Somebody could have a flashback. And so recognizing how to provide some grounding techniques for survivors. These can be things like having mints in your office, having some dark chocolate, having an elastic band that somebody can kind of snap against their wrist. Grounding techniques are similar to what they sound. They help a person to ground themselves into the physical. So if somebody's sort of starting to have an experience of disassociating, they're depersonalizing from their body, they're not present. So grounding techniques can help us in the sense of reigniting the senses. So asking a person to tap their foot while they're talking, to focus on the tapping. What does that feel like? If they have an elastic band, to snap that against your wrist. Can you feel that? Can you tell me what that feels like? Popping in a dark chocolate or a mint, something that awakens your taste senses. And of course, music can really help some people depending on their situation. So sometimes survivors are playing an iPod iPod or headphones with them. So ask them if they want to take a break and listen to a song, but being creative. So there's lots of ways that you could do this, but there's lots of ways you can have these little techniques within your office if you're going to interview somebody and you know that it's going to be really intense. And if they have a counselor or somebody working with them, you can ask if you should be aware of any sort of trauma triggers and their best coping methods for those, so that you could be prepared to kind of respond in that way for them if they can't have anybody else in the room, or invite that person to be in the room if it's appropriate. I think I've covered most of these. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about trauma reactions? Yeah. So that's what Andrew did. I can't take credit for it. But talking about just the challenges of language, right, and how it's stored and how it's inhibited during trauma. So the Broca's area of the frontal cortex, they looked at people who were experiencing sort of fear stimulus and how that became inhibited. So there's this challenge of language that we face. The interview goes on to talk a lot about body-based therapy interventions. So we did a significant study on yoga as an intervention for survivors of sexual trauma, and how trauma-informed yoga sort of had a more lasting effect on folks' recovery than maybe a language-based therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy where it's all talk-based.
My goal in my presentation is going to be pretty technical. I've tried to revise it so that it's not so boring and dry. But my goal is so that you can leave this room and actually go and type up one of these petitions and file it. And so if you are so inclined and so inspired, if you are interested in doing this work, I'd be happy to connect you with a survivor who needs your services, especially out here in the counties. Because as you can tell, I started my career in Philadelphia. I have really great relationships and connections in Philadelphia, but as I expand our practice, Jamie and I expand our practice out here in the counties, I need to turn to local counsel, so I can find out who is the right judge to put this petition in front of, or what is the process here of filing, or maybe even something like who is the clerk that I want to talk to, who's going to get this right. So we're talking about post-conviction relief, and for sex trafficking survivors, there's many different forms depending on what their record looks like, what sort of convictions or non-convictions are there. And of course, we've brought it up many times, we're going to be talking about vacator. So I want to make sure that you guys know what vacator is, where it comes from, the elements of the statute, when you want to file, when is the right time. I want to tell you about the filing process itself and get into the step-by-step detail instruction of that, and then give you more practice tips for working with survivors. So why is post-conviction relief important? We all know about the collateral consequences of a criminal record, right? It creates barriers to education, to employment, housing opportunities, public benefits opportunities, immigration opportunities. If you're in a divorce and you have a criminal record, it's going to come up. And just as Judge Neifield said, these collateral consequences don't just go away after you finish your sentence and you've paid back your debt to society. Although we do have this new trend of organizations and employers being more lenient about criminal records, there is a stigma that is attached to prostitution in particular, which is one of the most common crimes that a sex trafficking victim is convicted of. Post-conviction relief is important for people because it remedies a past injustice. And so in the context of vacator particularly, as Shay mentioned, this is something where the system, where the judiciary and the district attorney's office are all collectively coming back and saying, we were wrong. We misidentified you. You are not a criminal. You're a victim. And so for a lot of my clients, the vacator process, while it can be very painful and there are many opportunities for re-victimization, which we try to avoid, it can be a source of empowerment. it's a survivor-controlled process where they reclaim the narrative of what happened to them. And they're able to escape the stigma and fully heal from what they lived through, and they get validation. Again, that you are not a criminal, you are not bad, and we were wrong. My favorite reason why post-conviction relief is important is the impact that it has on our criminal justice stakeholders. Meaning, every time that you get someone's personal story out there to a judge, you're helping to inform decision makers and policy makers about all of the experiences that trafficking victims endure. And you're able to change that narrative of what does sex trafficking look like. In our space, before I even started working for the Institute, I believed those myths that Shay put up 2 hours ago. I thought smuggling is trafficking, there has to be movement, this only happens to foreign nationals, this is not a problem that's occurring in our communities. But now I know, given our state as the Keystone State, we have victims being brought into our communities, being trafficked within our communities, and trafficked out. And so it's important for us to share as many stories as possible so that we can really change the narrative about what trafficking is and how it manifests in our society. Here's a quote from the American Bar Association Survivor Reentry Project's Guide for Attorneys in Post-Conviction Advocacy. That's a guide that they created back in 2016. It's available online in full, and if you're interested in this kind of work, I encourage you to download that and use it as a resource. It says, "I knew if they fingerprinted me, I would have to deal with all of these memories again, and I knew they wouldn't hire me." It's that kind of non-future planning, that kind of combative thinking that Jamie was bringing up, wherein this survivor already presupposes that she's not going to get the job, it's going to be a horrific experience for her, and so why even try? Another survivor says it was like walking on eggshells. "I do have aspirations. I want an advanced degree. But it's scary because I think I'm going to hit the convictions and it's going to knock me back down. I really just want to put it behind me. People in my life today have no idea of where I've been, and I'd like to keep it that way. It's none of their business." I include this quote because it reminds me of one of my clients who I helped vacate several convictions for in Philadelphia. She had convictions for drug offenses and for prostitution. And in her recovery, she has been able to get certification as a peer recovery specialist. She does work for a drug and alcohol treatment center, but that's not where her passion lies. She doesn't want to just work in the recovery space, and she shouldn't have to be confined to that. She has aspirations for a career in healthcare, but unfortunately, with prostitution convictions, you can't get very far applying for school and trying to be in the medical field. Also, she told me a horrific story whereby she applied for a job at Target, and the employer, the person interviewing her, looked over. I guess I shouldn't have named Target. Target's still great, everyone. This one person, this employer who was interviewing her, looked it over, and actually, when he saw prostitution, he actually propositioned her for sex. So it does come up. And when we showed you prostitution and what the crime of buying sex is, I don't know if you noticed, but in there it says it's if you hire a prostitute or any other person to engage in sex, right, as a business. A prostitute or any other person. So my client was another person when she sat down for that interview. But when she got up, she was a prostitute. And it's very hard to escape that stigma with something like that on your record. This is a map of all of the states that have a form of vacator or post-conviction relief for sex trafficking or labor trafficking survivors. So the lighter blue, the full lighter blue, has vacator or expungement for adults and minors. The states with the stripes through it, if you can tell the difference here, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Georgia, they have statutes that are only for minors who are charged with these crimes. And then the darker states have sealing. So sealing is very different from vacator and expungement. It only goes so far. Sealing erases arrest or conviction data from public view, so it is going to be hidden from certain landlords or housing providers. It will be hidden from employers, but it is not hidden from government view. So it's still going to impact somebody with their record or with public benefits, things like that. So what is the difference? Expungement is something that anyone in this room right now has access to. It's just for those of us who have been arrested and charged with a crime but not found guilty. So if you were charged and for whatever reason the case was thrown out, it was not prosecuted, it was withdrawn, you were acquitted, you have the right to ask the court to take that off of your record. What it does is completely erase the information related to that arrest. And sometimes when you are charged with a crime, you're charged with many different things, right? They'll throw the book at you, is what they say. So you may have, for the instance of prostitution, you may be charged with prostitution and with criminal solicitation. We see those two charged together a lot. If you are convicted of prostitution and you're not a sex trafficking victim, and you go to trial and they withdraw the solicitation charge, you can still have the solicitation charge taken off of your record by asking for something called a partial redaction. Okay? So even if you have a client who you look at their record, they have some cases, some offenses that are eligible for vacator, and then some things that are not, and some convictions that you simply can't do anything about, be careful and pay attention to those charges that have been withdrawn or null-prossed, because oftentimes people give a guilty plea to a lesser offense, and if you see that a felony has been dropped, you can get that off of their record with a partial redaction, and it can be very, very helpful. Also with expungements, there should be no associated court costs, so there should be no financial burden on your client related to a case that they are not found guilty of. So again, that's something that anyone in this room has access to. This is what it looks like in the law. It's again, no disposition. If nothing happens after 18 months, you can have that information taken off of your record. And then there's a few other circumstances where you can apply for this as well. I will say that expungement can be a financial burden for some people if you don't qualify for indigent legal services or a public defender, then you are going to be asked to pay the filing fee. And I think, Caitlin, you were the one who did this statewide county-based research for me on how expensive is it. And I think some of the counties charge upwards of $350 to file this petition. We also have newly signed into law this year by the governor, the Clean Slate Act. I've told you what sealing is. This Clean Slate Act makes it an automatic sealing for any convictions for summary offenses. Those are your lower level offenses that are 10 or more years old. It also does an automatic sealing for people who have been convicted of second and third degree misdemeanors that are 10 years old. There are some exceptions to this. And then the most important exception to this is that if you have any felonies at all on your record, or if you have at least 2 first degree misdemeanors or 4 second degree misdemeanors, you're not eligible for this. So we told you the eligibility for participants in Project Dawn Court. They were women who have 4 are facing their 4th offense for prostitution. They're facing that state time, 2.5 to 5 years upstate. They would not be eligible for this, for automatic stealing, because they already have so many other convictions on their record. Any questions about the Clean Slate Act or expungement before I get into vacator? Okay. So vacator is in Chapter 30. It's in our comprehensive anti-trafficking statute. It's cushioned between many of those other protections for trafficking victims. It applies only to sex trafficking victims. And this is different from what we see in other states. Again, it's our human trafficking statute. It refers to labor and sex, but this particular provision is just for sex trafficking victims. This is another thing that we have repeatedly asked the legislator to go back and amend, because any one of us can think of 1, 2, or 5 crimes that a labor trafficking victim might be forced to commit as a direct result of their victimization. Criminal trespass, false ID, disorderly conduct, driving without a license. There's many things that they could be charged with, and I don't see any particular reason why they're not included in this form of relief. The statute also is limited to 6 offenses, and I'll get into that in the next slide. Again, it does seem to be a little bit arbitrary in the reasoning here of why these particular crimes, of course prostitution and obstruction of the highway, are included. But beyond that, it seems peculiar why it would be limited to 4 others. Other states, though, I'm not going to complain, because our neighbors in New Jersey only apply it to prostitution, and that's it. So we have a better law than some other states in that sense, but it's not as broad and expansive as it is elsewhere in the country. The statute also tells us that there needs to be a nexus to trafficking, right? This needs to be related to your victimization, otherwise you're not eligible, you don't count. It requires that you plead with particularity, and since what we know about trafficking survivors and the complex trauma that they live with, that does make it difficult, and so that's really the crux of our information today, is how to get to that particularity requirement without harming your client. Our statute also requires consent from an attorney in the Commonwealth before you can even file. This is really unique and different. Only I believe two of the other states that have vacator provisions or a set-aside law have this requirement. So I want to make clear what the distinction is. It's not notice. It's not a notice requirement. It's not consent to waive a hearing. It is actually consent before you can file. And so because this is such a hurdle, we use it to our advantage when we are doing this work, in that if the district attorney is going to agree to even let you file, you try to get them to agree to the entire petition and waive the hearing and have no objection straight from the jump. And it's really more about collaborating with the district attorney's office than it is about the adversarial process of who gets what and who's conceding to what. And then the best part about vacator, aside from cleaning up someone's record, is this financial restoration that your victims get. Court costs are completely eliminated. So there was a Supreme Court case, Nelson v. Colorado, it's very new, which said that when you have a conviction vacated, any court costs associated with that conviction, any monies that you paid into it, are due back to you, and your debt is completely cleared. So think about how restorative that can be for a trafficking victim who has, perhaps their court costs have gone into collections. They're facing massive, massive amounts of debt, and I'm telling you, it's a lot of money. It's not just, supervision fees when you're put on probation. If you are going to court multiple times for violation of probation hearings, or any other reason, each time you go back to court, a cost is tacked onto that case. Each time you're transported from prison, a cost is tacked onto that case. And I have seen some prostitution and some drug offense cases where the balance of that case is upwards of $2,000. So this is a lot of money that people can get back.
So just to give everyone an example, a graduate of Project On Court, who is a huge ally of the Institute and now works at Dawn's Place as a peer specialist. Many of you may know who she is. Her name is Anne-Marie Jones. When Anne-Marie went to seek, and I have permission to talk about Anne-Marie in public from Anne-Marie, just so everybody knows. But we have a deal. I have to call her and tell her that I've talked about her after I've done it. It's always a good excuse to talk to Anne-Marie. But when Anne-Marie went to get her driver's license, all of her court fines and costs had been turned into a civil judgment. And she had a scofflaw following her around. She could not get her Pennsylvania driver's license to drive to and from work, to drive her kids to school, unless she paid out over $2,000 in fines. So we're working with Anne-Marie on vacature right now, but that really got in her way. She had a job. She's working in a survivor-led, survivor-driven organization, and she had to come up with $2,000 just to be able to get a driver's license. So it's a huge barrier to survivors who even have jobs in spite of their conviction. Sorry.
No, thank you. And that's why I say it's one of the most important benefits of pursuing vacator when you can. It's worth it. So those are the elements of vacator: victims, offenses, nexus to trafficking, supporting evidence and particularity, and consent. So let's review. Who is a victim of sex trafficking? Under the Pennsylvania law, in our definitions, 3001, we have victim of trafficking or victim is an individual who has been subjected to human trafficking. Pretty straightforward. So what is human trafficking? Any activity in violation of Section 3011, which is trafficking in victims. It's the recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, maintaining, or soliciting for the Commercial Sex Act. And under federal law, it's any child, anyone under the age of 18 who is engaging in commercial sex, or any adult who is being induced or forced to engage in commercial sex by force, fraud, and coercion. And we all remember here Shay's very important point that the law applies to sex buyers as well. So you may encounter a client who doesn't have a pimp or cannot identify one particular individual who victimized them in particular, right? Doesn't matter. Under the law, if they are being bought, solicited, patronized, obtained for sex through the means of force, fraud, and coercion, or those 13 factors we have in 3012B, they qualify as a victim of trafficking. So here are those 6 offenses that the vacator law makes eligible for this form of relief. We do have prostitution. We have obstruction of the highway, which is kind of an outdated crime that isn't really charged anymore, but from what I've seen looking at people's records, it was really popular in the late 90s and early 2000s to charge prostituted people with obstruction of the highway, which is quite literally blocking a public passageway, right? Prostitution, loitering and prowling at nighttime, disorderly conduct, which is a summary offense, criminal trespass. I know that a lot of the women that we work with down at the drop-in are forced to do sex work, engage in commercial sex in abandoned houses and on other property that they don't belong. So sometimes they get charged with criminal trespass. And also simple possession of a controlled substance. And thankfully, this is not codified. This is not defined in the statute of which particular offense related to possession of a controlled substance. So I have actually read that to include drug offenses, possession of paraphernalia, and I've also read the eligibility of prostitution to include criminal solicitation. But when you have an entire docket, an entire case vacated, you don't have to worry about doing a partial redaction for, say, criminal solicitation that was withdrawn, because it actually erases all information related to the entire case. That just gets thrown in there. I would also encourage you to be a zealous advocate, right? There's other offenses out there that are not under the statute that the judge still has power to vacate the conviction for. There's a case out of New York, People v. LG, where the judge granted a petition that was over 15 years old. People v. LG. The judge granted a petition for a victim who had a weapons conviction on her record, and their statute does not apply to weapons, but the judge was convinced that this was a crime that she committed as a direct result of her victimization, and therefore granted the order. I would also suggest you attempt to vacate convictions for possession of an instrument of a crime. We know that out in Allegheny County, out in Pittsburgh area, they were prosecuting commercial sexual exploitation victims for prostitution and possession of an instrument of a crime when they had condoms on their person. And this is a policy that they are no longer pursuing after it came out in the media. I think it was sometime this summer. There was a lot of reporting on that, and
I got in a Twitter fight with the DA. Don't like it.
And did he give any insights about why they were charging this, or?
People ended on my police. In my Twitter war.
She's Shay Rhodes on Twitter, everyone. No. Go read that riveting back and forth. So yeah, get creative with it. I also interpret this to include any contempt convictions that someone might have related to a violation of probation matter for the underlying case where the underlying case is eligible. So don't just look for those 6, circle them, and get moving on. Really dig into their history and see what forms of relief are eligible to them and where you can make a creative argument. Because who doesn't like being creative with words? We're all lawyers, right? We like doing that. So the nexus to trafficking. It must be committed, the offense must have been committed by your client as a direct result of their victimization. And this is here, we have another case out of New York, People v. Gonzalez, where over 15 years had passed since the petitioner was arrested last, and she had absolutely no corroborating evidence whatsoever. She had her own affidavit, her own sworn statement, and she had the support of her therapist, and that was it. But they were able to make out an argument that convinced the judge in that case to grant her orders to vacate her prostitution convictions. So what if you have someone who committed an offense that was after trafficking or after they escaped the control of a particular individual? Or perhaps, as the judge pointed out, a couple of years have gone by and then the person seems to re-engage in this criminal behavior. There's many reasons why trafficking survivors will continue to engage in prostitution, one of which would be the economic reasons, right? This is something, they can't get a job anywhere else. This is something that they know how to do, and it's something that they're going to continue to do until they can get to a more stable place. So it's almost like a dog chasing its tail, right? You're continuing to do this behavior that got you in trouble in the first place, but you can't get out because you have the records of this behavior. But nonetheless, it is something that people do in order to survive. Survivors also believe that, maybe led to believe by their traffickers, and also by the system, as Jamie did a really good job of balancing that message, that this is all you're good for. Especially if you come from a family where trafficking and prostitution was just part of your upbringing, it's generational. You may believe that this is why you're here and this is what you're good at, and so why stop now? You're going to be proving the nexus to trafficking with your client's sworn statement, so with an affidavit that you get notarized, and you need to do that particularity. And I'm glad that Jamie brought up all of the ways that trauma impacts memory, and that it impacts a person's ability to chronologically access facts. And that's where you come in as a legal advocate. You have access to the record. You can file petitions to get more information from the police. You don't have to send your client in there, or you don't have to say, hey, when was the last time that you were behind bars? You have access to that information. You can fill in the gaps of dates, of times and places. But you also want to be asking for supporting evidence where you can. You want to subpoena medical records. You want to get foster care records or school records. You want the support from a therapist or from another social service provider who says, I have been working with this person and they did tell me about their victimization and I do think they're worthy of this relief. You're not going to have those clients, we haven't had one yet, who testified in a federal case. And you can just go and attach the transcript from the case, open and shut, it's done. It's very clear that they were a victim, they were named in the testimony and everything. You're not going to have that. You're going to have those clients, like in the New York case, where it's just one woman, it's just one person with her story to go by. And so it's really important to get as much corroborating evidence as you can. And then where there isn't any corroborating evidence, you can use expert testimony. And if you can't afford an expert, you can attach expert testimony as an exhibit from a different case. And they outline this in the ABA guide, so just really try to use all of your resources that you have to strengthen those petitions and bolster your client's story. So this is what the paperwork looks like. I'm a very visual person. I'm sorry I don't have any examples for you guys today, but please contact me and I will give you a redacted version, a redacted example of a full petition. But this is what it looks like in Pennsylvania to file one of these motions. You're going to throw your order on top, your order to vacate, and you definitely want to include on there the signature line for the district attorney. And you want to say no objection, and they sign right there on the order. So there's no question about it. You want those two signatures, judge and district attorney. Following that, you're going to throw in an order for a hearing. But again, once you get that DA's signature, there's really no reason to go forward with a hearing. So that's just gratuitous for the judge. After that, we have talked to the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts extensively about the information that they need in order to actually process these petitions, because it's very new, right? The law was enacted in 2014. Victims are not coming forward. They don't know that this form of relief is even available to them. And before I started pushing this work forward, only about, I think, 2 petitions to vacate had ever been filed in Pennsylvania. So each time we're doing this, we're perfecting it, and we're figuring out all along the way the actors who are involved and what information they need from us to actually succeed and erase this information. So what the AOPC wants to see is expungement data. So I have here Rule 790 or Rule 490. 490 refers to summary offenses, but basically you need to take an expungement petition, page 2, and sandwich it right there into your motion to vacate. Then you'll have your actual argument, make out this person is a victim of trafficking, they are eligible for this relief, these crimes are eligible. You will have your verification, you'll have their affidavit, their story, and then your supporting evidence. So it's a step-by-step process. As I said, I'm a very visual person, so here's what I said before, once again, in a different format. There are some informal time constraints for filing, so this is not going to be in a statute. This is just from my experience and talking to other attorneys who do post-conviction work. You got to wait a little bit. It's not in there. There's no time constraint. You don't have to, but you should. If it's only been, a week or so since the conviction or a week or so since the case was thrown out, show a good faith weight on that and look after those informal time constraints. And in the meantime, that's when you can be engaging with the district attorney, giving them heads up way ahead of time that you plan to file, who your client is, and what your theory of trafficking is. After filing, there are formal time constraints. And so there are 3 parties, the AOPC, the local police, and the Pennsylvania State Police, who are all involved in erasing this information. And we cannot rush them. We need to give them 3 months in order to actually erase the information. And once you do get that letter confirming that the erasure is done, go back and check the record, make sure everything's gone, and then everything should be closed out. Are there any questions about the process? Yes?
Why do we charge the victim with crime?
That's a really good question, and I wish I could give you an answer.
Perhaps moving forward, victims won't be charged with the crime, but as long as it's on our books as a crime to prostitute, to sell sex or be sold for sex, people are going to continue to be misidentified as criminals. Even though we do have an affirmative defense to say I'm a trafficking victim, hopefully some of the information that Jamie shared with you about trauma and self-identification issues helps to illuminate why someone might not tell their defense attorney, hey, I'm a trafficking victim. But
It seems very antiquated. The law.
Do you want to come work for me? Put you out in Harrisburg every day. I'm all in. Every day.
You're on.
So I just want to say one more thing about this slide. It's about the intake and referral kind of to the interview process. And I'm still learning how to do this properly. And God bless my clients who know that and who are learning along with me. But Jamie and I actually went out to Baltimore Law School where they have a clinic where they do human trafficking prevention work and they also do vacator work. But they only have prostitution, so we're still better. And the instructor said something that really struck with me, and she said, when you're forming the attorney-client relationship, when you're doing this intake, it's important to not only define your role and just talk about the law and what the law can and cannot do, but it's also important to teach your client how to be a client. Because in no other context have they had, presumably, have they had an attorney who is working for them aside from in a criminal context. And as a public defender, my clients knew way more about the criminal justice system than I ever did. But this is different, right? You are their lawyer, and you're going to help them with something that's going to change their life. And so it's important for you to not blow through that process, but to really sit down with them and tell them how they can be an effective client and what it means to be a client. That just really struck with me. So, of course, there's always going to be special issues when you're dealing with people's records, things that you want to keep in the back of your mind. And if nothing else, please think about immigration consequences. Engage with a specialist, an immigration attorney, if your client is a foreign national and does not have, a green card or some other kind of verified status. You also want to think about, are there any open criminal charges right now? Maybe this is not a good time to go ahead and ask the district attorney or a judge to vacate prior convictions. You want to think about active warrants. And then most importantly, I think you want to be aware of your client's own readiness and their stability. And that's where thinking about how to react to relapses, as Jamie brought up, and how to react to periods of AWOL or no call, no show, and a client that's just not communicating well with you, how you react to that is very important in this process and in avoiding re-traumatization and victimizing your client. So if you get all the way and they're not ready to file, that's fine. It's important to be patient and to also make sure that your client is addressing other social service needs. I like to engage with clients who have a therapist or have been to therapy, who have been out of the life for a while, and who are no longer using substances, because I've found that makes the process a lot smoother, and it really helps to communicate their readiness to move forward with this. So we kind of talked about venue considerations, who's the right DA to approach. You don't need to get the elected official DA to sign off on your petition. You can have any assistant district attorney, any attorney for the Commonwealth in that jurisdiction, and any judge for that matter. It doesn't have to be, though it can be the judge who convicted that person and had that person on probation. So I know in Philadelphia, I'm preparing a petition for a judge who had my client on probation for over 5 years. And she really grew up with this judge. And I think that this judge will enjoy the opportunity to further be a part of her story of restoration and recovery. So think about things like that. Judges who are going to be open-minded and non-judgmental. Not that I'm saying there are any closed-minded judges out there, but just in case. And leverage your network. As I said, I don't practice a lot out in these counties, and so I'm going to be relying on you guys out here to tell me, oh yeah, you need to go talk to, MCAP, and they'll be able to put you in touch with a really trauma-informed, victim-centered DA. And if there's multiple convictions across state lines, start with the most favorable jurisdiction. I have had clients who have convictions in Florida and New York, and actually in New York, a person can be certified by the state as a trafficking victim. And so we're like, let's go for that one first, and then when we file here in Pennsylvania, we'll just attach your certification, and then there should be no problem. All right, so in closing, I just want to go over a few practice tips that I have absorbed over the last 2 years. I really think that we should do a therapy for lawyers class here at the law school. I don't know if since I graduated something like that has been done. I know we have accounting for lawyers, which is great too. But man, I really could have benefited from therapy for lawyers because, aside from my own my personality and my passion for and my empathy for this population, I had nothing else to go by, and I know I've made mistakes along the way, and it's very important to just know that this process of asking someone to regurgitate the most horrific experiences of their life can be counterproductive to their recovery. It can hurt them, and it can also hurt you. I know we've heard about vicarious trauma, secondhand trauma that professionals in the social service sectors face. And I'm not really going to get into that here today, but I just want to say again that it's a learning process and it's okay to make mistakes. But just as Jamie was saying, it's important to be authentic and to check your ego. Remember that you are solving someone's legal problem and that they can't solve it without you, but that you're not in control, right? Your client has control. Your client gets to direct the representation and what they want to do. So here are just a few key tips on establishing effective communication with your client. You want to maintain boundaries. Don't be like me and start crying in the middle of an interview because something they said reminds you of your life and your experiences. It's very important to always maintain that I'm here to help you. It's not about me. I am the lawyer. This is what I can do. Here's how you can help me help you. But also be clear about what you can't do, right? I'm not a therapist. I can put you in touch with somebody who can talk to you. I can't drive you to drug and alcohol treatment, but I can help you get services that will get you there. So maintaining those boundaries is really, really critical. Monitoring expectations and anticipating concerns. So our clients are usually concerned about, is this going to get open to the public? Is this public record? Will I have to testify? Do I have to go to court? Do I have to go to a police station to get fingerprinted? The more that you can calm these concerns, the smoother the process will go. And you need to be as transparent about the timeline as possible. As I said, there are on the back end some formal time constraints built in, but on the front end, you just don't know how long it's going to take. And I typically tell clients it takes about 6 months, but if this is from start to finish, but if this is a brand new jurisdiction and I don't even know any judge and we're up in Wayne County where there's one guy, one woman I gotta go to, it might take a little bit longer. And one more thing I wanted to say about word usage. We were talking earlier about, I think Jamie was talking about using, being authentic, being open. If a client says something that you don't know what it means, if you don't have that prostitution pimping dictionary printed out and by your side, just ask. Just say, what does that mean? Or, I noticed that you talked about this person in that way. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Ask open-ended questions, and don't be afraid to use lingo, because that's what's going to make your client feel comfortable. So if you're always up there talking about, prostitution in a stiff legalese way, they're not going to open up to you about the true reality of their experiences. But at the same time, there are some legal terms that are critically important, and that in particular would be victim, right? And I'm never going to tell one of my clients that you're a victim. What I do tell them is that based on your experiences and what you're telling me, the law classifies that as a victim, and if we say so, then we will be able to get this form of relief. So I have some clients who still to this day maintain that they are not victims, and I'm not going to be the one to rewrite their story, but I'm also not going to stand in their way of this important relief.